All right, hello and welcome to lesson 7 of Last Epoch University. We are coming up towards the end of the lessons. I believe there are 4 more after this one. And this will be defenses part 1. We'll be breaking defenses into 2 parts because it's a pretty big subject to go over. And this way it'll be a little easier for you to find the information you want if you only need certain parts of it. So in this particular lesson, we will be covering HP, or health points, ward, sustain, and how resistances work in Last Epoch. Spoiler alert, it's different than PoE. All right, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, hit points. Most players who play ARPGs or even RPGs will be very familiar with this, but to give you a basic rundown in case you are not someone who is used to those games, it is your most basic defense insofar as it determines whether or not you are alive or you are dead. The more HP you have, the more damage you can take before you die. Should you hit 0 HP, you are dead. If you have 1 HP, you are alive. Anything more than that, you are still alive. It is effective against all types of damage because all types of damage go towards your hit points in order to try and kill you. High amounts of it can also negatively impact sustain though. So leech, regen, healing, which we'll cover very shortly here. If your sustain isn't high enough, so do bear in mind, you want to make sure you have enough sustain for the amount of health that you actually have. Ward is like additional HP. It's effective against all damage as well. Unlike PoE's energy shield, where it has a weakness against chaos damage unless you take a particular passive. I think that's still how it works. There is no such mechanic in Last Epoch. Ward will always protect you and will always be taken first before HP. You can generate ward through multiple sources. Ward per second, ward on hit, ward on use, ward on kill, etc. In fact, there's a new unique item that'll allow you to turn some of your health regen into ward regen, which is pretty cool. But multiple ways of creating ward. Mage and Acolyte have the most general support for ward, although Rogue and Sentinel also have some. Ward does decay over time. So, if you're standing in place, you will start to lose your ward that you've generated. Or if you're just doing anything, really, it's always decaying over time. The more ward you have, the quicker it decays. So if you have 100 ward, it decays slower than it does. If you have 1,000 ward. Why does this happen? Well, the formula here, if you did the math on it, you'd see that that's what's causing it. The formula is just designed so that the more ward you have, the more you will actually decay. Ward retention does slow the decay, though, so you can slow it down quite a bit. And you acquire ward retention through passives, gear, skills, and the intelligence stat, which gives 4% ward retention per point of intelligence. Okay, let's move on to sustain. This is how you replenish your HP or ward, but we've already covered that. How you replenish your HP after damage has been taken. There are 4 types in Last Epoch. 1 is leech, 2 is health regeneration, which is a passive regeneration that occurs over time. 3 is healing, and 4 is on an action, like on a hit, on a kill, on dodging, so on and so forth. Let's start with leech. Leech is percent of damage dealt, replenishing a player's health over a 3-second period of time. So if you deal 100 damage and you have 10% leech, you will get 10 health leeched back over 3 seconds. So 3.33 HP per second. It's very strong in high damage builds or with high percentage leech, and you can get very high percentage leech in Last Epoch. So you can get very, very strong leech builds. You can also leech dots, but you do have to be aware of the leech type. I.e. if it's on a hit. You can leech dots, you can leech spell. You can technically leech anything in the game, but certain sources of leech are very specific, i.e. melee leech or leech on hit or elemental leech. So the source is very important. Here are some examples of easy sources of leech that are in the game. Bleeding Heart is a unique that is primarily for non-spells. You technically can use it for a spell, but it will probably kill you. But if you don't have a spell, it's a very good source of leech. You can craft melee leech on gloves. And there are passives and skills for, I believe, every class has some sort of leech. I can't think of any off the top of my head that don't have any. So every class has access to at least a limited amount of leech right within a passive or skill tree. Okay, let's move on to regeneration. So this is just an amount of HP that you regenerate passively per second. You don't have to do anything for this. It's just a part of your base character as you are interacting with the world. It's continuously regenerating if you are not at 100% health. How much HP per second you have is determined by your base HP regen multiplied by your percent increased regen. Both of these can be improved through various sources. So for example, gear or passives. Let's take a look. Actually, I have a character up here who has both sources. You can see down there, I've got in purple plus 21 health regen per second. So that will increase my base regen by 21. And then let's go find a quick source of increased. Let's see, this one's actually got both. This has got a base plus 10 because of the 6-point bonus, and also 48% increased health regen. Okay, it is possible to reach hundreds of HP regen per second. The character I just showed you actually has like 250-ish, I think. Let's see, 228. You can get much more than that as well. But it currently does tend to be weaker than Leech for similar investment in most builds. Leech just requires so much less investment to get so much out of it. This was true 9 months ago when I first made LA University, and this is true now in the current version of it. Nothing really has changed there. All right, let's move on to healing. Healing is HP restored on heal, which is usually an instant. Usually is instant, but can also be a healing over time. So most of the time, whenever something procs a heal, you'll just get a certain amount of HP back, but there are healing over time examples in the game. There are many forms of healing, but they're most often found in skills. For example, Atera's Blessing is on this character as well. This gives you 100 health healed for the nearest allied target. And that can be increased, as we'll see, through healing, increased healing. Jeez. Increased healing stats, yeah. Healing effectiveness is actually the word I was going for. The increased healing on that that passive was just like differently worded. But increased healing effectiveness can be found on gear, it can be found on passives. That will also increase any form of healing as long as it's directly on your character or on a minion, if it's a minion healing, if your minion is doing the healing. Because minions and character are considered completely different. But as long as the healing effectiveness is to the right target, i.e. you're doing the healing, therefore you have increased healing effectiveness, the heal itself will be better. The strength of the healing is largely skill dependent. Some skills are much better at healing than others. Okay, the last sort of sustain that we have is on an action, some sort of action. When I do X action, I gain health. It is similar mechanically to healing, but it is not healing, and this is because it is not affected by healing effectiveness. So any healing effectiveness you gain will not affect these particular examples. For example, Rogue has a couple of passives, Sapping Strikes and Draining Arrows. Sapping Strikes gives health on hit. Draining Arrows gives health on bow hit. With high attack speed, these can be Marksman's primary sustain. They can be very, very strong. Sentinel has Time and Faith, which allows on use of certain skills, like Vengeance, to gain health. And then there's health on hit and health on kill that can be added on weapons. There are other examples, but these are a few of the more notable ones. All right, let's move on from sustain to resistances. Resistances is both very simple and also kind of challenging for some players who are used to other systems. So if you're coming from PoE especially, definitely check this section out. It is important to know how they are different. Resistances provide protection against the corresponding damage type. For example, physical damage. If you take a physical hit and you have resistance against it, you will take less damage from it. Elemental is cold, fire, and lightning. Poison, necrotic, and void. It protects against both hits and dots. So for example, physical will protect against bleed because bleed is a physical damage type. It caps at 75%. You will get no more benefit after 75%, except that it can protect against shred. There's not a whole lot of sources of enemies that do shred. Certainly not a lot of sources that do a lot of shred, but there are a few that do shred. Also, shock would be considered in that because shock has a shred effect. But you can get some protection against those if you so want to by going over the cap. It is generally encouraged to cap resistances early to mid mono. This is, of course, build dependent, player skill dependent, but for new players especially, early to mid mono, you definitely want to start thinking about capping your resistances. Before then, you can kind of just target resistances for the types of enemies you're fighting in the story. But early mid mono, you'll start to see a lot more diversity of enemies. All classes specialize in resistances in some way or another. For example, mages are largely elemental resistances. Rogues are poison, etc. So it just depends on the class. Some have more things that they can go into than others, but they all have something in their passive tree that can help you if you want to get your resistances outside of your gear. Even some skills can. Okay, here's where it gets a little different than Path of Exile. And most games that do resistances, by the way. I don't think any other game does them quite like this. So enemies gain 1% resistance penetration up to level 75. So at 75, they have 75% penetration against players. 100, still 75%. So that's the cap for it. They reach 75 at area level 75. Again, it's not player level 75, it's area level 75. So level 75 enemies have 75% resistance penetration. It's all resistances. There are no exceptions to this rule. This is universal resistance penetration that they have. Resistances can also go negative, which means for the player, if you're level 1 and you take a 100 damage hit versus and you have 0 resistances on you, you take 100 damage because they have no penetration and you have no resistances, so it's just straight through. But if you're at level 75 and you take a 100 damage hit and you have no resistances, you take 175 damage because they have a penetration of 75% on you, and that can go negative. Now, if you have resistances capped, for example, at level 1, which is not realistic that you'd have this, but if you did, at level 1 have 75% cap resistance against it, 100 damage, you take 25 damage. At level 75, with the penetration and your cap resistance, you'll take 100. You'll effectively mitigate all of the penetrated damage and be back to baseline. If you compare that to PoE, 100 damage at cap resistance, which is also 75% for PoE baseline. You can do things to increase it in PoE, but just baseline 75% cap resistance, you take 25 damage on a 100 damage hit. Another comparison to PoE, an important one, because of all the things we just mentioned, because of how penetration works, 75% resistance in PoE means you have 75% damage reduction. But in Last Epoch, at level 75, area level 75 or higher, 75% resistance is equal to 42.8% damage reduction. So versus 100 damage in PoE, at 74, if you have 74% of resistance, you're not completely capped. So this is just an example of why that's the case, right? At 74%, you'll take 26 damage. At 75%, you'll take 25. Right? You get 74% against 100, 26, 75 against 125, which ends up being a difference of 3.8%. The difference between 1 damage between 25 and 26. Now in Last Epoch, because of the penetration system again, at 74%, you're going to take 101 damage. At 75%, you're going to take 100 damage, which is a difference of 1%. So it's significantly less effective. It's still effective, but because of the penetration system, it's significantly less effective. It's easier to calculate how much resistance you're going to get on a per resistance basis because of it. It's literally 1%. But it does make it less effective overall. So capping resistance in PoE is more important than in LE. But you should still strive to cap it in LE because it's still valuable. Like, it's 42.8% DR is still a lot. It's just not as mandatory in PoE, and you can get away with not capping resistance for a lot longer. And in some cases, you actually don't have to fully cap because, again, 1% DR is just not as powerful as 3.8% DR. Like between 74 and 75, it's just easier to get away with that. All right, that's everything for this section, this lesson. Look out for Defenses Part 2, which should come out exactly a day after this one did, where we'll cover the rest of the defenses. Thanks again for watching. If you'd like to check us out on Twitch as I go through playing the game and making builds and doing all the fun stuff that is a part of LE, we'd love to have you there. Also, we have a Discord where we have lots of people who are very helpful if you'd like to come in and chat and ask some questions. Thanks again. I'm hoping you're really enjoying your time in Last Epoch as much as I do, and I will see you all again real soon.